Yes, I'm so okay. We are recording. Yeah, and so I decided to do my art gallery and just to have a space that's like comfortable.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah, I'm in a place that I'm in for usually when I do no background recording, so I don't have much of a background compared to my Zoom spaces in there. But other people are using it because it's a shared space. And
Oh, okay,
this is
all right.
fine.
It looks pretty. I like the stencils on the wall. It
Yeah,
looks
it's
very
like
nice.
cloud ceiling, if you can see.
Oh, very lovely. We had in our last house, we did that. We had the whole room was painted like pale blue, and we had pictoglyphs done in like iridescent. So as the light
Cool.
changed in the room, different pictoglyphs would show up.
Oh, neat.
It looks so cool. I'm so excited. Can I just tell you how excited I am?
Well, I'm equally excited. I think
Excellent.
we are both great admirers of each other's work.
Yes, and weirdly tied together by 1,500 things that are very small
Yes.
and strange, right?
Yes, many overlaps.
Yeah, it is weird. So let me just sort of do a quick intro, and
Perfect.
then we will be able to just mutually admire each other for an hour or so. Okay. Okay,
Excellent.
great. Hello and welcome to a special episode of Yuri Studio. A few weeks ago, I talked about some reading recommendations for books for fans of Revolutionary Girl Utena. And among them was the Terra Ignota series by Ada Palmer. And I'm very excited today to invite Ada Palmer here to Yuri Studio, where we're going to talk about her book series, the fourth of which just came out in November and was amazing. And we're going to talk about Tezuka, and we're going to talk about Utena, and we're going to talk about all sorts of exciting things. So Ada is an award-winning novelist, a composer, and she teaches history at the University of Chicago. So thank you very much, Ada, and welcome.
This is an absolute treat. So I've been admiring and reading your reviews and keeping up with the world of Yuri through you for ages. So definitely a mutual admiration get together.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And obviously, I'm a huge admirer of your work. I think the Terra Ignota series is just about one of the most brilliant things I've ever read. So I can't wait to get into this. So let's talk about this really great series. So the first thing is that I listened to every interview you did, and I read every interview you did, and everybody asked the same like 5 questions, which is typical, of course.
Yes.
So if anybody who's watching this has not read the Terra Ignota series, I'm afraid you're going to be a little lost for the first portion of this.
I can give the micro intro, and then I can give the anime / manga reader version of the micro intro.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Fun to compare them to each other.
Exactly. So why don't you give the micro version intro of the Terra Ignota series, so people who are not familiar with it will become familiar with it.
So the intro that I give when I'm talking to science fiction readers is this takes place in a 25th century where a network of flying cars that are so fast that you can get from anywhere on Earth to anywhere else on Earth in about 2 hours means the whole world is collapsed into commuting distance. And it's perfectly reasonable to buy a house in the Bahamas and work in Paris and have a lunch meeting in Tokyo, and your spouse works in Buenos Aires and has a lunch meeting in Antarctica, and this is no problem. And once that's been true for a couple of generations, it has a big impact on people's lives. One is that you don't have to not live near your friends. When you finish college, you have a bunch of friends. You can all buy a house together, and the family unit shifts. But another is that, people no longer feel that geography should dictate citizenship, because where you happen to have been born is related to where there was a great house for sale when your parents were going to have a baby, not where your identity is nested. Right. And so they've developed a system of non-geographic nations where when you come of age, you choose which of a bunch of different global co-mixing political groups you think represents your values and has the laws you want to live under. And then you do, and you pay taxes to them and you obey their laws. And maybe your next door neighbors or your spouse are under a different law because they chose a different country to be part of. But if you feel like you're French, it doesn't matter whether you were born in Japan and live in Buenos Aires, you can be French because that's your choice. And it becomes a buyer's market for citizenship as countries have to compete to attract citizens, which then changes a whole lot about competition, about law, about economics, about all sorts of things. And then within that, there is a seed of something that seems to be supernatural, which we're following along. And then there is a mystery. So that's the introduction that I would give to science fiction fans.
That's
The introduction that I give to anime and manga people is that if you like Utena, you know that 18th century stuff is code for we're going to be doing gender and gender blurring and female princes and questioning all of that stuff, and also looking at revolutions. And the whole thing is written in the style of an 18th century philosophical novel, because the 18th century in Japanese literature, and especially anime and manga, has this wonderful tradition of being used to question and examine gender. And this is a future that has silenced gender by making it taboo to discuss gender, but gender is still everywhere in people's thoughts because they haven't actually done the secondary work of making sure there aren't gender-based prejudices.
Right.
So
They just said, don't talk about it.
Right. So it's brushed onto the rug without being actually equal.
Right.
And as a person put it very aptly lately, everyone in the Terra Ignota universe who identifies as any gender is trans, because everybody is assigned non-gendered at birth, and you're supposed to pretend you're non-gendered, but most people still treat each other and perceive and act on gender.
Right.
And one of the processes of this is that the world is gradually coming to understand its non-coping with gender. So that's one of the ingredients.
Right.
Another one of the ingredients is very Gundam-like examination of the ethics of war. Another of the ingredients is very Tezuka-like examination of the question of AIs and AI development, AI citizenship, AI ethics, and techno-utopianism and global collaboration. And it also has
dystopianism.
And dystopianism. And it also has similarities to speed grapher in ways that I will not spoil, and to Gankutsuo.
Thank you for mentioning that. I thought, wow, I was like, did I? Well,
so I finished doing the plot and world build before Speed Grapher came out, and then Speed Grapher came out. I was like, oh, this show is for me. This is full of things that people can compare to my book. This is great. And then the other is Kenshin.
Okay.
Because of the way I deal with the protagonist coping with his terrible past and his deeds in the past.
Right.
And Kenshin and the sensitivity with which that's dealt with in Kenshin. And in Kenshin, it's never okay. Right. It's never okay. It's not as if like I have an angsty backstory and that now makes me cool and I'm redeemed. Everything is fine. Like, no, okay, right? It's not okay. And it's never going to be okay. And we can have tenderness and we can have domesticity and we can have Kenshin working hard to help everybody else. But, Kenshin still wakes up in the morning every day and it's still true.
Right.
And so ingredients of that are very
excellent
in there as well. So that's my for otaku version.
Thank you for that. That's awesome.
But one of the things that's very true of the science fiction and fantasy world is that lots of Anglophone FNSF novels and so on get translated into all different languages and go out into the world and are very influential. And then all the different language groups in the world produce really cool FNSF, almost none of which is translated into English. Right. And we get a handful every year of a few things out of French and a couple things out of China, maybe. Right. And maybe
starting
one
to get a bit of Japanese
Finnish
now.
stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But we get tons of anime and manga.
Yeah.
And for decades, it has been the one language group in which we get our reply. Right, that Anglophone FNSF gets translated, and then Japanese FNSF, if it's in anime and manga format, would get translated back. Now we're getting novels and so on much more often as well. But for ages, it was the like one point of global back and forth instead of just out.
Right.
And so one thing I've worked on as a science fiction writer and otaku is trying to introduce to the Anglophone science fiction world some of the elements of FNSF that are more developed in Japan than they are in the US.
Okay.
Because, they've been developing in different ways, but, Japanese FNSF is great on AI ethics and AI rights, and it's gone deep into that.
Well, sure, really because of course, starting with Tezuka, right? Starting right back at the beginning there. Yeah.
Amazing on gender play in the shoujo tradition, and amazing on war survivorship as opposed to war tragedy. And I'll unpack that by giving an example. I was playing one of the Gundam Seed ending themes for a science fiction writer friend recently. And she was asking what it was about. And I was saying, well, it's about being sad that the young men have to go off to war. And then the phone rang. And I was interrupted and she said, die, right? And I said, well, no, actually, it's not about that. It's about the young men have to go off to war, commit atrocities, survive, come home and live with it.
Right.
And that really crystallized for me how much the the Western tradition, especially the British tradition and then British influenced US war fiction, is very much about the young men go off and die.
Right.
And Japanese post-World War II war fiction is much more about how do we cope with having been guilty of atrocities?
Right.
How do we process this? How do we live with it? So there's lots of, space opera and war SF in Anglophone science fiction, but it's asking different questions about war.
Right.
It's not asking, what do we do when we're the ones guilty of atrocities and then we have to live with it? It's much more asking, how do we cope with losing our friends and that kind of thing, which Gundam also does. But
Right.
it's a different set of questions to ask.
Right. And how does it affect the people around us, and how does it affect the people when we come home?
Right.
And a lot of European fiction does that as well. You have Martin Deguerre, how is it, what does it happen when you come home and you've been away to war and your entire framework for how to deal with people has been completely shifted?
Exactly.
And that's very much embedded in everything in Terra Ignota.
Yeah. And so I wanted to bring, it's full of all sorts of FNSF questions, especially some of it is modeled on Voltaire's science fiction, which also asks different sets of questions.
Sure.
And I guess is also in translation because it's French. But I very much wanted to engage with some of the stuff that I was finding so exciting in Japanese FNSF, and also to introduce it to people who don't read comics and so aren't getting it, or don't watch animation and so aren't getting it, and who don't necessarily need to, but would love to hear just that one really cool concept about like how Naoki Urasawa dealt with the question of AI homicide in Pluto, or
which was amazing. That was an amazing series.
So incredible.
That was so incredible.
Yeah.
So many tears.
Or to hear about Utena and the amazing way that it makes gender be the literal central characters of a narrative like that.
Right. Without actually ever centering gender.
Yes.
That's the thing. That's the thing that's amazing about Utena, because it's like, okay, we're putting this thing, and I think that's a lot of Ikuhara's work, where he says, we're going to put the giant thing right in the middle and then never address it. And everyone's going to be rotating around it, like, a parental abuse maybe, or time slips or whatever, but he's never going to say, this is a story about this thing.
Yeah. And so you can get really deep in before you realize, oh, wow, this is all about, and it clicks, and there's that amazing moment when it all comes.
Yes, like it's that's the veil, the scales fall, it's exactly. You always note that you drew inspiration from a lot of things we think of as now as pop culture, as you've just said, and a lot that we consider classic literature. And I think that's very, very overt, particularly in perhaps The Stars. And I wonder if you see any connection between those two things in the way humans relate to them and then rework and reiterate them all the time.
So, one of the things that I think is very important to remember there is that a lot of the classic literature that we consider classic literature now was pop culture. Right. Shakespeare was pop culture. It was the cheap thing you went to the theater to go see. It was the equivalent of going to the Marvel movie first releases. Right. And people were excited and talked about it, and it had interesting ideas, but it was pop culture. And so was Voltaire, and so was Diderot. And
so was Homer.
So these things weren't elite things. They were made into elite things later by later societies that appropriated them and wanted to say, okay, the study of the classics is an elite thing that differentiates you from the uneducated, and therefore we're going to differentiate that. And this is one of the things I study in my history. I specialize in the Renaissance, which is a lot of when ideas about exactly what studying the classics meant shifted. Right, because all the way through the Middle Ages, they're studying the classics and they're doing all sorts of stuff with it. But in the Renaissance, they crystallize more some of our now inherited ideas of what it's about. And a thing that's very helpful to realize is that for a chunk of time in the late Middle Ages and earlier portion of the Renaissance, a lot of scholars believed that all Latin literature had been elite literature because they believed that in ancient Rome, people spoke Italian and that Latin was an invented language, that it was never a native language for anyone, that just like with them, it was an elite language. So, late medieval linguistics, highest tech late medieval linguistics is, in the beginning, everyone spoke Hebrew. Adam and Eve spoke Hebrew, right? Everyone spoke Hebrew, and Cain and Abel spoke Hebrew. And then the Tower of Babel happened. And God punished the world by fragmenting it and making all of these vernacular languages, which, I love this phrase, have no grammar.
Okay.
meaning they have no solid structures and they shift and change and they have lots of dialects is what they really mean by that. And that then the Greeks, being brilliant, said these languages suck. They don't have the technical vocabulary and clear verb tenses necessary to express philosophy. Let's invent an artificial language. And that ancient Greek was an artificial language invented by the Greeks to have philosophical discourse in.
Okay.
And then the Romans looked at that and said, that's a good idea. What does Rome do? We copy good ideas the Greeks have. We'll make our own artificial language and it'll be Latin. And instead of being optimized for philosophy, it's going to be optimized for rhetoric and epic poetry. And so that's what Latin was. And so they think that only elites ever used it and that it was never anyone's native language. Cicero spoke Italian, but he spoke Latin sophisticatedly with his peers.
Right. And
their thought is, Latin is hard. Kids and prostitutes can't learn Latin. And we're like, yes, they can. But the period's understanding of linguistics was they couldn't. So they looked at something like Plautus, which is absolutely lowbrow comedy that everybody was going to, exactly like Shakespeare. And they think it's elite literature. And they look at it and they say, this fart joke can't be a fart joke. It must be an allegory, or it must mean like the exhalation of the soul. It can't. And so they do all this bending over backwards to try to fit into their understanding, because they can't understand that Latin was just a normal language and it was not an elite language on top of stuff. Right. And it was that sort of understanding of this is elite activity and separate from popular activity that gets entrenched and creates for us this category of elite literature or classics, which in some sense means ancient Greek and Latin stuff, but becomes to mean serious literature. Right. And then different things get moved into that category. And it might be Plautus and Cicero, or it might later on be, Petrarch's poetry, and it might
Tezuka's anime becomes classic.
Yeah. And Tezuka becoming a classic.
Right.
But also Shakespeare and, all of these things that make that transition. Now, there are some works that are written to be elite and literary. There are. I don't think there used to be as much. Once the idea of a literary canon,
literary fiction came around, people started doing that
as a result of that.
Right.
Yeah, but I want to work really hard in my fiction to treat all of these things that were always the popular literature everyone was engaging with as co-equal with each other.
Sure.
And so that's why I make a point of treating Voltaire and Romeo and Juliet and Gundam co-equally as source material.
Right.
Because they should be.
Right. They should be. Well, I talk a lot about Murakami's super flat, where high art, popular art, high culture, low art, low culture just gets squished together. And I really like his artwork for that reason, because he's like, there should be no difference between fine art and not fine art. Why is one thing and one is the other? I mean, why is this, why is comics, which takes just as long to do and requires just as much skill, considered low or pop as in some sort of, dismissive
or
way?
Why is an oil painting that becomes a book cover not in the same category as an oil painting that doesn't become a book cover?
Exactly. And I think, and when you're talking about how things were pop culture, I have said this for many years, that I feel like the kinds of derivative work we do as fans now that often end up morphing into original work, but a lot of it, fanfic, fan art, cosplay, all those very, very derivative works are no different than what the bards were doing. They, like, Homer's telling stories of characters that people already knew. It's not like
absolutely
they're making up stuff. You're saying, well, let me tell you about Sailor Moon. I remember the time Sailor Moon came to your town, and we go, ugh, it's a Mary Sue, ugh, who cares? But what the heck were the bards doing with King Arthur? King Arthur came to your town. Do you remember when your great uncle?
Arthurian is one of the best examples of this. And I think we can't understand Arthurian and its evolution without thinking of it using the category of fanfic. It helps make a lot more sense.
Yes.
And
I was
it even
Arthurian
produces
scholar,
literature that has some of the shared characteristics. So for example, Orlando Furioso shares with many big long fanfics the characteristic of assuming you already care about all of these characters
That's
and
right.
not bothering to establish them and explain who they are, which when you understand it as fanfic makes perfect sense.
Right.
But when you compare it to other epics and you're like, why isn't he establishing his characters? He isn't establishing his characters because it's
Because you
got the
already knew who
structures
they
of
were.
fanfic.
Yeah, I think
Right.
Arthuriana is exactly that, you know, where you care about that particular knight because he was from your local your country. You know, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that goes to a lot of the chansons from Europe, where you had characters that people knew,
Well,
you know, Roland, the Song of Roland is another one of those, you know.
yeah, and it's really the advent of copyright in the early 17th century that makes people think differently about this. In the 15th
Right.
and 16th centuries, people are perfectly happy to write a new book for the end of the Aeneid,
Right.
or publish something that is, you know, 60 books of Pliny the Elder, where what we mean is a bunch of real Pliny the Elder and then a whole lot more books that people wrote that are in the style of Pliny the Elder. And you just call it Pliny the Elder because it's that style of thing.
Right. Or
Just
John
as you can
Newman,
say
who
this
traveled the
extra
world without
sailor.
ever leaving his home. You know, he had a whole, talked about the whole world. I don't think he left Oxford. Another thing about Terra Ignota that I can't get out of my head, and you alluded to this about
Yes.
when geography is no longer important to us, when we are no longer identifying with our geographic locations, we still create communities of intent centered around common values, ideals, and cultures. And we see this all the time with fandoms, right? And I wondered, what is it about humanity that makes us do that? And I thought maybe you might have some insight, given that you spent a lot of pages thinking about it.
I did spend a lot of pages thinking about it, and fandom and the formation of diasporic fandom communities was indeed one of the models that I was looking at. And the fact that we have a body of friends that we can recognize as, you know, this is a group of people and they live scattered everywhere, and then they appear together at Otakon every year and then they scatter again, or they appear together at Worldcon every year and then they scatter again, but it is a community. Or Anime Boston, where I was staff for 15 years, and, you know, gather together and become that. So that was one of the things I was looking at. But another was the EU. And, you know, I had an experience when I was abroad in Florence studying at an institute, and there were a bunch of scholars there. Many of them were EU scholar families, which meant you had a dad from Spain and a mom from Austria, and their kids were born in Britain and lived in Australia for a few years, and now we're in Italy. And I would listen to these families having conversations about which citizenships that their kids were eligible for were most advantageous and useful, and which ones they should try to make sure their kids had. And they were going to have another kid should they travel to the place where the other kid was born, so the kids would have the same citizenship or not, and how it was and wasn't useful, and which citizenships you were allowed to have both of and which you weren't, and how useful it was to be able to have this one and that one, and listening to those picking and choosing conversations and thinking about how we have lots of identity groups that we sort of pick and choose, in as much as some people really care about being alums of their college, right? And other people kind of care and kind of don't. And some people really care about the ancestry, right? That they're ancestrally Italian or ancestrally Irish or whatever it is. And other people maybe just as actually ancestrally Italian or ancestrally Irish and not care very much. And it doesn't matter to them as much as their sports allegiance matters, or their fandom allegiance matters, or their, you know, some people really care within the US what state they're from, and some don't, or what city they're from, and some don't. And we have lots of different communities in which we invest different amounts of our identity. And observing that and thinking about the fact that we already are picking and choosing more so as we move around, because some people, you know, are from a state and go off to college and like never particularly care again about the state they were from. And other people are from a state, go off to college and really talk about California and, you know, really identify with being from California and hope they can go back to California. And even if they end up living permanently in Massachusetts,
They're always from California. Like I'll always be from New Jersey, no matter where I am. Yes.
Right. And other people, you know, don't. And so as geography becomes more and more flexible, and as it's more and more the case that you're going to live where it makes sense to live, our choices about, I care about being in this group and not this group, you see them all around us. And I think we form those groups because they help shape our identity and values, and they connect us to people, and they give us the human relationships and people to collaborate with and people to share joy with. Mitfreude, the German word for having joy in a friend's joy, or having joy from seeing somebody you care about having joy, sort of very different from Schadenfreude. Mitfreude, wonderful word. These communities supply that. And they also supply tools for deciding how to make decisions and what to support and what to not. And so it made sense to me for that layering to continue. So, in Terra Ignota, there aren't just the big polities, the hives.
Right.
There are also countries.
Right.
So like the equivalent of the EU and then France. And there are also these other strats.
That was great. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can choose to be in the EU and not a member of a country.
Right.
Or you could choose to be in the EU and a member of a country, or you could choose to be a member of the country and not in the EU, and in one of the other options. And in all of those, you can choose to be in the bicyclists strat. And, some people really care about being bicyclists, and other people ride a bicycle to work, but it isn't something they really care about, right?
And on top of that, there's also the legal, your gray law, white law, and black law choices, which level of, I guess, in a sense, legality and morality you actually follow.
Exactly. And so, as people have more geographic independence, you kind of need more of your identity to be active choices you made about what groups you were in.
Right.
Because when your whole world is where you are, pre-internet, when most of your interactions are people within a few square blocks, you have automatic identity groups.
Right.
And you might have some supplementary identity groups, but they're going to be weaker. You're going to have less contact with them. You're served an automatic couple of dominant identity groups, which are city, country, language,
school,
group, neighborhood,
whatever,
school, employment. And then, if you have national ties or ethnic ties or religious ties, those communities.
Right.
But as soon as we're more interconnected, now we have dozens more options of what we identify with. And so that made sense to go forward to being even larger parts of our experiences, but also larger parts of our identity, which goes with how Terra Ignota is also a future of the clothing as communication movement, where when you're in these groups, you communicate that to everyone who sees you by wearing clothing that codes it. And if you're, a
which is obviously something that people do. I mean, we do that. People do that all the time. I'm literally wearing something that codes what it was important to me right now. I have all around me symbols.
We do it for fandoms. We do it for sports. We do it for music.
Right.
But, in this future, if you're somebody who's really into tea, you wear stripy socks that code that you're a tea fancier, and other people might see that and have a conversation with you about tea. And other people might drink tea. Other people might drink lots of different kinds of tea, but not want to have a conversation.
On why Yunnan is really the best. Yes, I understand.
Yes. Because the more people mix, the more you want to be able to find your people. Fan person. So that it becomes like being at a giant convention and walking around and spotting somebody who's cosplaying the show you like, and then striking up a conversation with them.
You're running over to go, oh my God, you look great. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Or having groups of people getting together to do meet and greets where you have, 17 people who are whatever character from this series, and you get like all the other people come together, and there's there's 30 people and they're all from the same series, and now they all know they're effectively a form of family.
Exactly.
Absolutely. That's amazing. So I want to ask you about what inspired your specific hive concepts, because I think a lot about those hives. I really do. I have spent many days going over the concept of like, why humanist, why Gordian, why these specific hive concepts.
Yeah. And I wanted a variety both in what their values were and in what their origins were, because, and this is zooming back in the world build, the idea of this is that the flying cars develop. As soon as the flying cars develop, then the challenge becomes crossing borders and facilitating border crossing. And organizations would inevitably crop up to profit off of trying to make that easy. And here the corollary is global entry, right? And what is global entry? It's you pay a little bit of extra money, you're in an elite group, and then you get to move in and out of things,
A little easier. Right?
things a little easier. And so I realized that right away, multiple groups would crop up, corporations and nonprofits, whose function was facilitating movement. And so then I thought about which ones would likely crop up. Well, there would be for-profit ones. There would also be ones that were focused on a specific well-established industry. So there would be one for concerts and sports tickets, because it benefits everybody if you can make it easy for people to buy sports tickets in your place and go in and go to the sporting match and get out. There's a lot of money to be made there. That's the sort of money that can facilitate a corporation that can be powerful enough to leverage stuff.
Okay.
And then I thought, well, there would also inevitably be nonprofits that tried to do this in a way that was socially constructive. So the cousins evolved out of the idea of one that was trying to do this, but trying to do this in a sort of socially proactive and in the conception of the cousins feminist way.
Right.
And it starts as a women only, and then struggles with the women only thing because people are like, are you including trans people? Are you not? What about non-binary people? And then open up to be anybody who has the sentiment of sort of nurturing. And it's called the cousins because the idea is modeled somewhat on couch surfing, and the idea of a community of people who've signed up and are friendly people, and if you're visiting a town, will agree to come meet you at the airport and receive you and help you find what you need, the way a distant cousin would, who you may never have met, but like you have their address from your mutual uncle, and so you meet them. And a perfect stranger is actually just as similar to you as a cousin you've never met before, in terms of their willingness to receive you and show you around a town. So that could have developed out of something like couch surfing, which could then develop at this point into one of these groups. So then there would be a bunch of these, and there would be more than just 5. There would be a dozen competing groups that do this at the point that then this large war, the church war, which looms over this phase of the 21st century in that world build, happens. And then those groups are the groups that have the power to evacuate people fast. But they're mostly going to be groups that the wealthier classes of places are signed up with. So you have a situation in which the wealthier people all over the world are easily able to speedily evacuate themselves and their wealth to some extent from hotspots. And then you have the, oh no, but we're leaving people behind. Quick, we've got to try to help people who weren't already part of these groups movement, which would be led by the nonprofit one, right? And some of the ones that want to be globalist. And then thinking about how that would evolve toward a lot of tensions about citizenship, because if this extremely unpopular war, which is really between 2 different sets of religious extremists, this is imagined as a war between Christian fundamentalist extremists and Islamic fundamentalist extremists, none of whose values are reflected in most of the wealthy elite populations who are flying around. This posits a continuation of the trend of right-wing Christian fundamentalism having a lot of political power, but not a lot of popularity among with the wealthiest, especially tech populations. You get a split between what A, the majority of people want, but B, what the majority of wealthy people want, versus C, what the country is doing, which is how you get the critical mass for the Great Renunciation, this moment when the wealthy elite teaming up with idealists and some progressive political leaders step forward and say, this war is not okay. We refuse to participate in this war. We are announcing our citizenship, and we're going to let these global groups become our citizenship instead. And then you have, the wealthiest in a lot of countries suddenly leaving those countries. Those countries get destabilized. Lots of other people are in danger, which results in both the development of those groups trying to get more people in, like the EU, trying to invite more people to join it so that it can use its international infrastructure to do this, but also the development of new groups at that point. And that's the point that the Masons slurp up a lot of the abandoned population. And is also the point that I imagine utopia forming out of hey, we're a disparate group of people that want to be a political group, and people being like, you're just a bunch of nerds who like anime. Why should we take you seriously? And they're like, because there are a lot of us and we want to do this. And they're like, okay, well, you can't do it unless you have $1 billion to prove that you're an economically meaningful person. And then in 24 hours, they're like, we have $1 billion because there are a lot of fans. And if everybody chips in, which everybody would, that would not be hard.
Right.
As we see from things like when the ridiculous thing was happening with the GameStop stock.
Right. Enough people chip in a little bit and it changes everything. Sure. We see that all the time with Kickstarters, right? A creator says, I'm doing a thing, and all of a sudden that's funded, you know, instantly.
And so, you know, could we have a country and its ethic is we care about the space program and love fandom and fiction and nerd energy, and all the nerd communities contact each other, and you know, overnight, sure, they can raise $1 billion because people are scared in the middle of war and all in for that.
Sure.
And there would have been dozens of different groups that formed like that. So the humanists, which you cited, is a merger of several that were oriented even around concerts or performance or sports that eventually merged with each other. And you originally had dozens, and then they're merging because once this becomes the dominant social unit, then the larger ones are more powerful.
Right, which is a lot of the power structure and power struggle in your story, where they're constantly shifting and moving around, trying to find ways to do this within the other events. You know?
And so they have very different origins. Some of them were for-profit corporations, some of them were non-profits like Greenpeace, which is where the environmentalists all throw their energy there at the beginning. And then these merge each other and settle into becoming a new structure. I don't know.
Okay, so where was the origin?
But a lot of my thinking was, so remember, Gordian originates as being the biggest of the for-profit companies that was doing this, and the first one that was doing it. So effectively, Global Entry.
Okay.
And then their cunning CEO,
so that's why the data. That's why all the data crunching.
All in.
Right.
Well, the idea is that he went all in on, yes, let's do this renunciation. We're going to be the new social unit. And then it's after that that he becomes entranced by the Brillist psychotaxonomic science thing.
Okay.
In the way that you so often have somebody who's a fantastic political leader at 35 and then at 55 is into something weird. And you're like, that's kind of weird. Why are you suddenly all over this? And sometimes it's a weird thing that we like, or like Al Gore, you spent a long time before becoming Mr. Environmentalism and now you're Mr. Environmentalism. That's interesting. And other times it's like you become a Scientologist or something, you know? And so I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if the group that was very strong at the start then takes this sort of veer as their charismatic leader, as human beings do, develops in an unexpected and odd way and forms the Brillists who are dedicated to this. And then the biggest group ends up shrinking to the smallest by the time we are a couple hundred years later, because, you know, yes, they're big and powerful, but on the other hand, they have this very peculiar obsession with mind mapping and personality evaluation that many people find off-putting, but that others find valuable. Understandably
so.
An important thing about understanding history is like lots of things grow and then shrink.
They shrink, right?
And it doesn't make any sense for the thing that was biggest at first to still be biggest later.
Yeah, exactly.
And a great example of this is IBM, right? And, you know, around the time when I was a kid, IBM was huge. It for computers, right? And no one would ever have imagined that IBM would come to be a medium-sized company while there were other bigger companies doing this. IBM was computers. There was nothing else, right? And the idea that IBM is still thriving, it's still a big, important corporation. It's going to last a long time. But no one would ever have imagined that it would be, you know, number 8,
right,
instead of always being the whole industry by itself.
Industry, right, exactly.
Yeah, that's how real things change. Is something is enormous and then something else is there that's bigger, and you're like,
and we see it all the time with communities, specifically online communities. So, you know, we started back like with Zanga and MySpace and LiveJournal, and now they're nowhere and they're nothing.
LiveJournal is a great example where a particular change in LiveJournal just meant that it melted away
Right.
very, very quickly because of a very specific thing.
But, you know, and even over time, there's always going to be a life cycle processes. So people get into something, they all use it when everybody's using it. People start shifting out of it because everybody's using it, and they move to something new and exciting. I actually have a question about
Well, they also shift out of it because, just briefly, they also shift out of it because when everyone is using it, it gets more effective information control, both in the form of censorship gets competent and in the sense of corporate backed funded advertising dominates it.
Right.
And so you have an incentive to move to the new platform
where
you're the kind of person who's
West,
being silenced on the current platform.
Right. Where's a bit of a Wild West.
We refer to this in censorship studies as the early adopter effect.
Yes.
And the earliest adopters of any new information technology are always going to be the sort of marginal voices that were being effectively silenced under the old one, whether it's people who are being drowned out or people who are being actively censored.
Right.
Which is also why every new social media thing we hear about, like, it exists, and then 6 months later it's full of alt-right white supremacists. And then, you know, why was that? Well, because they were being effectively silenced under the earlier system, and they therefore were among the early adopters. But so are LGBT communities, and so are civil rights activists, and so are everybody who's being squished under the old system.
Right. And then there's also, and particularly among nerdy folks, that sense of like, well, it was cool when nobody else was using it, but now that everybody's using it, it's not so cool anymore. When my grandmother's on it, you know, I'm going to go find somewhere else to be.
Yeah, and we want to find each other, so we'll move to the space where the percentage of the population that is the kind of person you're looking for is higher.
So I assume that a number of the folks that are going to be watching and listening to this are LARPers, and I've heard you talk at length about your LARP-esque program that you run with your classes, and I want you to tell us a little bit about it, but more importantly, I want you to talk about what you think it does specifically to help get complicated historical periods and situations across to students, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so briefly, this is a simulation of a Renaissance papal election. Every student receives a 10 to 20 page character sheet with their backstory and their personality and their traumatic childhood memories and their best friends and their animosities and what they want and their list of goals. Every character is unique, every goal list is unique, and everyone gets an envelope of resources, which are index cards that you can trade, and some of them represent money or land or titles or your niece and your nephew, and you can make marriage alliances with people, or, you know, a jeweled necklace or a horse. And everyone has different things that they want, and you then interact and negotiate and form factions, and they eventually elect a pope, and then that pope makes a bunch of decisions which affect the shape of a war, and they fight a war. And inevitably there is a peace faction that can triumph, peace can triumph, but there's a lot of reasons war often happens, and there are people who are trying to keep the war from being on their, you know, their city. You want the war to be over there,
somebody else's city, right?
You know, deflect it. And it sounds like Model UN, but it's very different from Model UN because the personalities are very vivid and the grudges are very deep, and the people are not doing what is the strategic thing. The people are doing what their character would do. Right. Because no matter how much it makes sense to strategically vote for that dude, if that dude murdered your uncle and tried to murder your father, and ever since you were 5 years old, you have seen the scar on your father's throat where he almost died, and your whole life you haven't been able to go outside to play because you're terrified of assassins, and so you spent your whole life as a kid stifled in a room because that man wants to destroy your family. You are not going to strategically vote for that man. You're just not, even if it would make rational, objective sense in terms of your goals. No. And it's interesting to me when people come into it from Model UN expecting the kind of pure calculation, this is to my advantage. And instead they get, no, my character is pious, and my character took a vow, and my character is not breaking the vow. And you may be a hypocrite who is breaking your vow, but yes, my city will burn. I am keeping this vow because I'm playing one of the characters for whom that's important. And that just doesn't happen in Model UN. It's really people wedded to, and people, characters who seriously care about family honor, characters who seriously care about love, characters who seriously care about vengeance, characters who seriously care about their monastic order triumphing over the other monastic order. And you're like, but France is going to invade Italy. And they're like, yeah, but my monastic order will triumph over the other monastic order. That's much more important. Don't you want to know the correct way to get to heaven? It doesn't matter if France sets fire to Italy, everyone will go to heaven. Fine.
So what about this do you think really, I mean, is it the emotional quality that really sells it?
It's the emotional quality and the bias, because the weird thing we do with history is we try to teach it neutrally. And we try to describe, here are the factions and here is what they did. And we do this with this sort of clinical distant judgment. And so often the result of that in a class is the students are saying, why didn't they just stop having the French wars of religion? Wasn't it obvious that they were going to lose? They were super outnumbered. They're stupid. They should just not do that. Or why didn't they just not have a feud? Feuds were bad for everybody. If they had just stopped it, what's wrong with these people? They're idiots. We're smart and we can see that any fool would not have this feud. And that's so often what you come away with reading
stop for a second. I think you've jammed up a bit, Ada. Your camera and sound have stopped.
Oh, I think we're restored.
Okay, there we go.
All right, now we're restored.
All right, so sorry about that. So
yep, that's fine. So often students come away from a class feeling like the people involved in this thing were just fools. And if they had just made the smart decision, then
sensible decision, right?
Yes. Right, the sensible decision. And so I put them there and like, this is a feud, and here are people, and here are some people who would make a great pope, and here are some people who would make a terrible pope. But if you vote for the terrible pope, your home city won't burn down. And the terrible pope will take revenge on the man who murdered your uncle and tried to kill your father.
Right.
And if you vote for the good pope, the French will burn your homeland to the ground, and the man who murdered your father will get a nice house in the Swiss Alps and be rich. And so you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it. And so every year the students come in, this is not scripted. They make their own decisions. They form factions. It's fascinating to watch the power blocks form, what the patterns are, and they get really dedicated to, their city. My job is to defend Milan, and I'm going to defend Milan. And, I realize that the decisions I'm making that are going to defend Milan risk a lot of other things. Right. And and they betray each other. When they betray each other, they get really upset. And then they're like, no, I'm going to see you burn. I'm not going to make the compromise. I want you to burn because I'm going to burn with you. And I'm going to make sure we both go down. They make all of these choices, and they come out of the other end of it understanding that it was the system and the lived relationships that made these situations impossible, that made bad pope after bad pope get elected. And my best summary of this is when I ran it in 2016, and we were running this in the fall, and they elected a terrible pope, and he started a terrible war, and the next week Trump was elected. And in my morning class, my other class, my normal class, all of the students who came to class sullen and angry. And the conversations that I heard before the class were, how can people be so stupid? How can people vote for this? Are people evil? How could, and the students in that class, they weren't like that. They were energized instead of sullen. And it was, I get it. It's a system. It's the structures of the system. It's the incentives. It's the people who realized that if they were complicit in this terrible thing, they get the thing that they care about more than anything else. We need to fix the system. And they looked at it systematically.
Right.
And that's what you get out of it, is realizing that it's all of the first person perspectives added together that create the inescapable system that meant that the feud can't end. and that the French wars of religion are gonna go on,
Oh,
and that
right.
that the faction and that the bad popes are gonna be elected and keep being elected
Keeping
and
like,
keep being
right.
elected. And you come out of it realizing that judging history clinically as just a set of statistics and saying, of course, they should have stopped having the French wars of religion isn't how people work. That
Right.
the systems are made of people.
Right.
And so it's weird to say it, but I want them to come out of this biased.
Right.
And they come out of it biased, and they come out of it loving their side and hating the other side.
But it really does, explains how people work.
Exactly.
It's absolutely true, because we're complex systems, and systems that we create are complex systems made of complex systems.
And so when they then read about a different period in time, or they read about a contemporary issue, they're able to look at it with empathy. And they're able to look at it and say, all of the people deciding this didn't sit down and say, wah, ha, ha, I'm going to be evil. Right. They sat down and said, what do I need to do to get the thing that I think is more important than all the other things?
Right, right.
And those incentives added together to create this bad result. Let's talk about that. Let's understand people's motives. Let's understand the system. And that's what I want them to teach. That's much more important than them actually knowing what happened in the Italian Renaissance.
Right, or this person being voted in Pope or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, and they sure remember that, you know, because they had to learn it, and they hate that guy. He murdered their father. They're never going to forget this. I have a folder
40 years from now, they'll be like, I remember.
I have a folder on my computer of selfies that students have taken in front of the tomb of their character from this, so that they've gone to Europe and gone to the tomb. But it also has several where they've gone to visit their enemy and like go like this or go like that and go to visit the place they were murdered. And if, you know, yes, they're biased forever about 1 4-year period in the 1490s, but they are now more open-minded and empathetic forever about every circumstance where you're trying to understand how human incentives work together to make a bad outcome from a social structure.
That's awesome. What it does. I can't even begin to tell you how amazing that sounds. Every time you describe it, it just sounds absolutely outstanding. I have one last question specifically about Terra Ignota. What was your favorite part, or the part you found most fun to write in the series?
There are way too many parts to give that an answer. I would say that the part I always knew I was going to have to work hardest at would be, so putting it one way, there are 2 chapters in the 4th book that weren't harder than the hardest chapter of the first 3.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a lot of very difficult technical writing craftsmanship in book 4, which having read it, you can understand, and that those chapters are all different in structure. And
I mean, amazing. I can't imagine what you had to do every time you had to rethink the way words work in so many ways.
You know, and I worked very hard on developing the relationship between the narrator and the reader.
Okay.
Which builds very slowly from the very, very beginning.
Right.
And so what I would say is my favorite thing is that I did it. You know, I succeeded at what I was doing with the relationship between the narrator and the reader, which goes from the very beginning, from the first word, which is you,
right,
to the very, very end. And it was a careful, complicated arc. Done in tiny corners and individual sentences scattered through every chapter that set that up. But in another sense, in book 4 takes on an epic tone. And this is where Homeric imagery becomes more and more high stakes
and more overt.
And so that language is not just hard, but it's people have a high standard for it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're gonna do epic language, you gotta earn it.
You have to sell it.
You gotta earn it, and you gotta sell it, and it's hard.
Yeah.
And I can vividly remember sitting down to do the most epic chapter in there and taking
which was
a breath.
Fantastically epic. I mean, I just grinned my way through it. Like individual lines and whole passages were just magnificent. I have quotes from that chapter that I've kept just because they're wonderful.
Yeah, and that, you know, sitting down like, okay, I've worked really hard. I've leveled up a lot. I can do this. I'm ready for this. Go. And the satisfaction of reading it afterward, being like, I did it. I did
You
it.
totally did it. You absolutely did it. I do actually have one more question, and this one's a super simple one. Nothing I'm asking is easy. So your works, this series includes issues of gender, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, neurodivergence, and trauma without making them the story. They're just woven in seamlessly. Can you talk about the series' perspective on these many things?
Perspective, yes, and also the way they ended up getting worked through was quite different, which is to say, I planned gender as a big ingredient from the start. Rose of Versailles and Utena were among the texts that I knew I was drawing on, and I wanted to be in dialogue with that and with Voltaire's engagement in gender. So that is all the way through, but that was intended from the start. Engagement with race and racial diversity was much later, when I realized, oh, my world build being global and my cast being able to be from all over the world means that I have a very racially diverse cast. I should make sure that I think about that fact and make sure that I'm being sensitive about whether too many of the positive or too many of the negative characters are people of color or people of particular ethnicities or not. And I should make sure that the people of color are visible so that people realize that this is a multiracial world. And I should also make sure that there aren't like more racialized descriptions of the people of color than of the white people, because that's awkward. And I worked hard at that. And I would say that one of the things I am dissatisfied with and would revise with the first two books is that I tried hard at that, but I didn't do as good a job as I would like. And I think I did it better in the third, and am most happy with it in the fourth. But I want, but that's something that evolved as me realizing this is powerful, realizing it partly from keeping up with the science fiction world, where there was a lot of discussion of the importance of representation and having characters of color present in narrative, that made me realize, oh, I have characters of color. I should make sure that the narrator actually says that they're characters of color, because in fact, the reader necessarily can't necessarily tell if I don't mention it. So, revisions had more reminders of that, though I think too many in the final version for books 1 and 2. And then disability was something where I had finished writing the first 2 books and was writing the third when I realized that the disability that was already present in the books was powerful. That I had put it in there very naturally. In a number of different characters, a number of different places. It was something that I thought of very natively, but that I hadn't realized was important as representation until there were conversations about it in panels at conventions. And then I realized, wait a minute, this is actually important. The fact that I have this in here is good, but it's also powerful. And so I write about it a little bit more visibly in the fourth book, because I'm conscious that it's powerful there in a way that I wasn't when I was doing the earlier books. And, asking myself, why was it there? Was it there because I'm myself a disabled chronic pain sufferer? Partly. I also think it's because I grew up with disability in my family, which made it very natural. But it was interesting to me that it was something I discovered late. So each of those, which are all the way through, I came to think about as being powerful at different stages.
And I think the way it develops because of that, when it gets to book 4 and these things are much more upfront, it works better in a lot of ways, where suddenly you're suddenly, yes. Like I saw it, but I didn't see it. And for somebody like myself, some of those things become more obvious. And neurodivergence too. I think some of the characters very, very naturally appear to be neurodivergent. And that also it's addressed more overtly in the fourth book.
Exactly,
again.
Because, I outlined the whole series from the beginning. Everything that was going to happen was planned from the very beginning. But between the release of the first 3 books and finishing the fourth, I had conversations with readers who were really delighted by my depictions of characters who are neurodivergent, or what we can call future corollary to neurodivergent, because a set is not something that exists.
Right.
A set being this type of person who's raised inside a computer interface with artificial senses.
Right.
And that doesn't exist, but the debates around them and the
Right.
stigma around it and the issue raised by it
Right.
are very strongly parallel. And the fact that that person processes sensory data differently from everyone around them, and the way
But
people
also
feel about
Jed,
them.
don't you think that?
And
that
also Jed,
reads that
exactly.
way as well?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no.
Right.
You know, Jed does not read it like any neuroatypical person who exists.
Right. Except for those who have told me that
future,
it reads like them.
Well, one of the characteristics being that a lot of, I mean, huge numbers of people are different, but you'll notice that one of the characteristics of J.E.D.D. Mason is that he doesn't move and he doesn't stim.
Right.
And he doesn't do a lot, which, we all do.
Right.
That he has this motionlessness, and it's intended to be, he is different from everybody in a way that lots of people are different for everybody,
Right,
but
right.
also in a way that is unique to him.
Right.
And so in the fourth book, I was thinking more self-consciously about the fact that these things were powerful and making sure that they developed in a way that were visible in that sense.
I think it really worked. I really do. And I think it couldn't have worked. In some ways, I think it worked better because it evolves. So that in the fourth book, you make these points so much more overt, and it doesn't feel like anybody would look at you and go like, you're beating us over the head. It's like we ran along this conversation with you, and when it lands, it all lands perfectly.
But from the beginning, it was posited as a future that is better than ours, but still has a lot of problems.
Yes.
And so I sat down and said, okay, some of our problems are race and gender. Let's imagine a future that's quite a bit better on race.
Right.
Not perfect on race, but quite a bit better on race.
Right.
But not as much better on gender.
Okay.
And cross compare those things to each other. And so is there racial tension? Yes. And we feel it in a number of small corners. And it's definitely still present, but you can also see that it's a lot better than our present is. And you're like, that has been progress, but also people still talk about it and are aware of it and are working on it and conscious of it and think about it. Whereas gender, because it was silenced, it's the silencing that's the reason that it didn't progress. And there I was thinking of, you don't actually get this discussion very much since 2016, but before that you would run into those, feminism is over. We don't need feminism anymore. We're done. Women have the vote. They have this, they have that. Feminism is over. Let's stop having this.
Let's never mention it again. Right. Exactly.
And you're like, no, we're only beginning to vaguely understand the degree to which gender is ingrained artificially into us from an early age, unconsciously by the narratives we're exposed to. Not that it's biologically ingrained, no, but that it's taught to us in infancy by things as, there's that amazing study that when at least in the US, when we interact with a 1-day-old newborn, the very first interaction you can have with a newborn is you put your finger and they'll wrap their little hand around it. And if we perceive the baby to be a boy, we tug and test the strength. And if we perceive the baby to be a girl, we don't.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So we're giving that brain different stimuli and different expectations
right away, right? From literally
before this baby can see objects.
Right.
Before this baby has learned to tell that you are a face.
Right.
We are telling this baby boy and girl get different treatment. Of course, we can't just eradicate it in a few decades by giving women the vote, because it's passed on through actions we don't even realize we're doing in this complicated and unconscious way that we're only just starting to study. We need to study it for another century before we'll really know how it works. And Terra Ignota silenced and shut that down. And so that's why I imagine, race gets steadily better and better and better.
But
and gender plateaus.
Right.
And so then this is a future which is realizing by the end that gender has plateaued.
We have to address these things, right? And becomes toxic for not addressing it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then in terms of disability, it's the very natural, when there are new technologies, we will have new disabilities. And that's just always been something that's been obvious to me. And it's interesting that it's not, right? But medical advances means people survive who would die. And that's why we have more disabled kids now, because they lived.
Right.
Yeah, we
have
more
asthmatic kids, more, yes, exactly.
Right, all these different things. And we have more people who need a robot arm because they survived losing their arm.
Right.
and as we have more technologies, we have more people who survive and therefore need assistive tech and live longer and need other stuff. But we'll also have new ways that a body can have strain put on it, like Tully Marty, who spent a long time on the moon and has bone damage and muscle development from being on the moon. And we have, carpal tunnel. We had to invent the keyboard for there to be carpal tunnel. We're going to keep inventing things that are going to keep making new problems because
our bodies are junk
and new disabilities as we create new stuff. The future will have more disability in it, not less. We'll get better assistive tech and better treatment and support for the things that are already there, but we're constantly going to be making new things that result in new disabilities. And that's just always been obvious to me. I think partly because of studying medicine, but also partly because of having disabilities in my family that I knew were ones that would have been much worse, at earlier tech levels.
Same for me, because I have MS. And I remember, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it might have been a death sentence, same exact sort of thing, where it's like, I'm still here because of better advances. But yes, that also means that now I get to deal with the other parts of that while my body sort of just slowly disintegrates around me. So yeah, absolutely. I want to move on a little bit. You were very kind to let me read some of your work about Tezuka, and I want to thank you very much. That was a lot of fun.
It's a treat sharing it.
It was really great. So you often mention as inspiration Tezuka's works, Gundam and Utena, when you mention what really inspires you. But I want you to tell us a little bit about how you encountered anime and what particular things in those bodies really spoke to you. And you did a little bit, but if you could talk a little bit more about that, that'd be great.
So I read comics along with my dad. We would read comics together from middle school, and he borrowed some Ranma 1/2 from a coworker. So that was my first manga. And similarly, he borrowed or got a recommendation for, and we rented from Blockbuster, first Tank Police and then Bubblegum Crisis.
Excellent choices.
And from there, I was watching stuff, both with friends and with him, moving forward all the way through college and then grad school. So those were my introductions. And I vividly remember my first encounter with Tezuka. I was at the comics shop near Bryn Mawr College to pick up my usual comics, and we would always browse around, and they had the 2 then freshly released Viz Blackjack volumes when Viz did just those 2. And I was looking around for something new to try and said, "What's that?" And a friend said, "I don't know. I think I've heard of that author. They were mentioned in a magazine as something that was important." I said, "Okay, I'll try it." And I bought the first one, and I read it while walking back to campus. And I got to about 15 paces from the front door of my dorm and turned around and walked back to the store to get the second volume because it was just so good. And then, loved it and read more of it. And then it was a couple years later that the Metropolis film came out. And so those 2 together were what introduced me to, wait a minute, this is more than just, I like blackjack. Who is this person? And what is going on? And from there, I started looking into it a lot, made a website about Tezuka because I liked it so much. At that time, the web was young-ish, and it was a prominent enough website. This is tezukainenglish.com. that Tezuka Pro contacted me to say, like, who are you? Can we collaborate on Tezuka's English language profile? So I did some work with them and for them, promoting things and talking with them about helping to advance Tezuka stuff, which is also how I got to meet Fred Choate and wonderful things like that.
Nice.
And reading everything I could get a hold of. Of Tezuka. And what I love is his engagement with metaphysics. And his engagement with ethics and the reincarnation system.
Your writings about that was outstanding. So why don't you explain that a little bit to the people that might be watching here?
A lot of people hear discussions of his star system, how he has characters that he thinks of as actors and they recur in different stories, which is true. But he then, especially in later works, is thinking about reincarnation, which is the through thread that runs through Phoenix, but also cross connects with lots of his other works. And then you realize as you read them side by side that because, as Phoenix teaches us, karma works outside of time. And sometimes someone in the ancient past had a life of suffering because that was the karmic retribution for some terrible crime they committed in the future.
In the future, right.
But also because it led them to the wisdom that they, in a different life in the middle, prayed to receive, and that it's all interrelated, but it operates out of order and outside of time. Then you look at the other works that he was writing both then and just before then, so they were fresh in his mind, and you realize, oh, wait, this chapter of Blackjack is the reincarnation of this character from Phoenix. And the wish that he made in Blackjack was granted in Phoenix. But in Phoenix, it was a curse because it was his punishment for this other thing that he did that all cross connects. And once you work them together, you realize he's having a very complicated set of karmic wishes and retributions, where very frequently the thing you ask for in one life is also the punishment that you deserve for a crime in another. That was just fascinating, and such a rich and neat engagement with ethics of metaphysics and the larger question, which is very similar to Voltaire's question in Zadig, of if there is providence or karma and all of this is actually just and does actually make sense, but we aren't allowed to see it.
Right.
We don't get to know why we're suffering. We don't get to see what the crime was, which is a punishment. We don't know about that wish because it was in another life. Is that okay? Can we call that fair? Can we accept that? Can we love that? And Tezuka's world is full of the juxtaposition of people like Blackjack, who is angry but can accept it, and Sarita, who accepts it fully, and Rock Holmes, who cannot accept it.
Cannot accept his fate ever.
And lashes against it to the end, except in Buddha, where the actual Buddha is actually right there to tell him, Rock, it's okay. But short of the actual intervention of the actual Buddha, which is the one, otherwise it's always, he
rails against the
railing to the end. And that diversity of reactions was so beautiful and so fascinating to see Tezuka asking this question of karma in such a parallel way to how Voltaire, who I was reading at the same time, did of providence.
Cool.
And that in both of their cases, the question isn't, is there justice? The question is, if there is justice, but we aren't allowed to understand, isn't that still cruel?
Yeah. Is that justice?
Right.
Is that really justice? Specifically, as I read your essays, it really struck me that Terra Ignota is a hard look at Tezuka's theme of the inevitability of war in first contact situations.
Yeah.
Among other things. So is that, or what are the concepts from these bodies of works are players on that board?
Yeah. So, the question of what do we do if there is providence / karma and it has a plan, but the plan isn't kind?
Right.
Is one of the questions.
Right.
But indeed, another is, are we naturally bellicose? Do we always lead back to war? Can we get better? And for those who have only read a little Tezuka, but not a lot, or who haven't had a chance to look at the stuff that isn't in translation, Tezuka has dozens of what we can call first contact stories. And it might be first contact with aliens or with things that live under the ocean, or squirrel people, or little tiny elf people from Australia, or AIs. And also first contact situations between human nations, or between the three-eyed ones and people, and other such things.
Right.
And out of 100, there isn't genocidal war once. And that's Astro Boy. It's the only one. All of the others, there is genocidal war, and sometimes there's actual genocide, and sometimes there's like halfway to genocide, and then people get dialed back. And in Tezuka's nature studies, which develop out of the dissertation he did on pond slug reproduction, but also his ideas of biology, which you see in works like Apollo's Song, he has this idea of life as naturally competitive and naturally cutthroat. And, the sperm must all war with each other, and only one will survive to reach the queen. And he speculates that nature is like that, and that's why humans, when we meet other things, we kill them, and when we meet each other, we kill each other. And he's asking this question, can we not? And story after story is, can we not? Can we try not to? How can we try not to? Which is, Tezuka, who lived through World War II, looking at that and saying, can we not do it again? Are we capable of not doing it again? What would it take to not do it again?
Right.
And so he writes warning after warning after warning where people do it again and again and again. And a lot of that is about helping the kids who did live through World War II, but whose parents aren't allowed to talk about World War II because censorship, see what happened and understand what racism is and what nationalism and fascism are.
Right.
So that in a situation where the newspapers aren't allowed to talk about this and mainstream literature isn't allowed to talk about this, you
Which
can
is
still
sort of where
have
we're back again now. So that's
nowhere near that.
No, just as the tide is turning sort of backwards to sort of smooth out the ruffles of history,
Well, I mean, let's recognize we have a tiny bit of that current. Now is the time to stop it from getting bad.
Right, exactly.
But, decades after World War II, the newspapers in Japan still weren't allowed to have the character to print the word atom bomb.
Right.
Like that is a totally different level of censorship.
That's like straight up censorship. Yeah.
So you had kids who, their town was blown up, and when they ask why, no one will say anything. Right. But here is Astro Boy fighting a dictator called Hitlini, who wants to genocide all of the robots.
Right.
And here is Astro Boy hired to help a robot rights activist who is trying to be the first robot to run for president or the first robot to vote in the US, and the US is filled with racism. And here we have a racial equality activist talking about the history of slavery and prejudice toward African Americans and how this is affecting robot rights. And you can talk about it in a comic book because the censors weren't paying attention to it because it's
right.
kids. So he's doing that. But Astro Boy, which becomes a really critical central text, the partner being Phoenix, is the one where it works. And the world has collaborated and worked really hard together. And we have this program of very close collaboration between the US and Europe and Japan. And they're all teaming up and sharing technology. And through advanced cooperation and techno-utopianism, there is peace. And we even have civil rights for robots, and humans encountered robots and gave them civil rights.
Right.
And it's the one. And so the message is, we have a 1% chance.
Mm-hmm.
We have a 1% chance of not having another war.
Right.
We've had World War I, we have had World War II, and there's a 1% chance of World War III. And then you get the flashback where you find out how Astro Boy got rights, right? How robot rights were passed. And you just read my essay on this,
right.
But it wasn't us.
Right.
It was aliens. It was aliens who he saved, and to thank him, they held the earth at gunpoint and they said, give the civil rights to the robots or we will kill you. And the humans said, okay. So he didn't even have it be us in Astro Boy. It was someone else holding a gun to
a certain amount
head,
of pessimism about our ability to do that.
He had a lot of pessimism about it. But Astro Boy does show this sort of thread of hope of it's recognizing it's super hard to not do this, but we have to try, and we have to try. And not only reading Astro Boy, but reading about people who cared about that model, people who in Japan became peace activists because of reading Astro Boy, and who became scientists because of Astro Boy, hoping that they would create peace-making technologies, not as code for weapons, but as code for actual peace. Right. So very interested in that question. And then the question of, okay, well, if there's a 99% chance of war, can the war happen but still be better?
Which is really there's a real overt surface discussion of that in perhaps the stars. How do we make this war the shortest war?
Right. And how do we make
the war
this
with the
war
least hurt? The least
hurt, the least unnecessary death, the least sort of unnecessary destruction. And how do we make this be a war where both sides are worthy of respect?
Right.
Or all sides are worthy.
All sides, right. All sides, yeah.
If there's got to be
all sides recognize that,
Right. As opposed to, how do we not do the terrible stuff? How do we not do what World War II did?
Right.
How do we not do what World War I did? How do
Right.
we not do what you get so poignantly in? And if anyone watching this hasn't read it, Shigeru Mizuki's Showa, which
Right.
is now out in English, this
Yes, by
history of
Zach
Japan.
Davison, brilliant
Oh,
stuff. Yeah.
oh, so amazing.
Yeah.
Showa, which really shows you that how do we not make bad choice after bad choice after bad
Right.
choice to make
Leading to
this.
the destruction of a generation of young people. Yes.
Yeah. Well,
Exactly.
and other young people coming home having been complicit in this and having to live with
Having
it.
to deal with the fact that they committed those atrocities and now have to deal with, yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Other than Tezuka, who is a manga writer or creative team that you really like and why?
I really love Naoki Urasawa, who's doing amazing stuff and doing Tezuka stuff. I really love Fumio Shinaka.
Okay.
Owoku is just stunning.
So like the all history part, of
Yeah.
her work. Yeah.
Well, also just the sensitivity and the characters are so powerful. She's everything is powerful. I mean, I really love, What Did You Eat Yesterday as well. I love her autobiography, the Not Love But Delicious Food Makes Me So Happy.
I love that one. That was awesome. Yeah.
Great.
That was a great one.
But she did the cover illustration for the Japanese edition of Jacques the Fatalist.
Oh, okay.
And she has that Gerard and Jacques manga, and I became sure it reminded me of Jacques the Fatalist. But then when I saw that she'd done the cover for the Japanese edition of the Diderot, I realized, this is a fellow lover of Jacques the Fatalist. We are rare. My dream would be for, if there is a Japanese translation of Terra Ignota, to have Fumio Shinaka do the covers.
Okay.
To be like her cover for the Diderot, because it's just perfect.
Nice.
So I love her. I love Naoki Urasawa. I love Junji Ito.
Yeah.
There's always existential and metaphysical depth to the horror in Junji Ito.
Isn't it interesting? Because horror is never superficial, really. It cannot be superficial.
I mean, slasher horror is.
I mean, it can be, but still, then when you start
weird
thinking about
horror, the horror that goes deep and deep and deep,
yes,
is just great. So those are great. Those are my favorite sort of currently active authors.
Are you reading anything now?
I always forget the name of the mangaka who did Princess Jellyfish.
Higashimura Akiko.
Yes, who's also fabulous.
Yes.
What am I reading right now? I'm reading, I've been reading Skullface bookseller Honda-san.
Excellent.
Which is as niche as it gets, but is great. I've been self-indulgently enjoying Otherworldly Izakaya Nobu.
Oh, that's wonderful, isn't it?
It's so charming.
It is charming. I love that one.
Pleasant and charming. And I love how there are actually second-order consequences to this impossible food being in this place. So I've been really enjoying that. It's really exciting getting more Poe Clan, obviously. I'm trying to think what else is on my currently reading pile. It's a big pile. I'm reading Requiem from the Rose King still.
Okay.
Because of my Richard III buffness. What else am I reading? I wish I was in the other room to see the mountain of new arrivals. Ping Pong Club. I can't remember whether more volumes are still coming out of Saint Young Men, though I still have one that I haven't read yet.
Yeah, they are still coming out.
Okay.
I mean, not in Japan. I think it's done in Japan at 18.
Yeah,
maybe?
but here. Yeah.
Okay, here. I think they're up to 15.
Cool. What else? Asadora, which is Urasawa. I've been really enjoying. Those are I'm sure there's a dozen more.
Right, but those are some of the things. I have one more Tezuka question.
Yes.
What would Tezuka's affiliations or Hive be?
Tezuka would have grown up very tempted by Utopia and very tempted by Greenpeace Mitsubishi.
Okay.
And also very tempted by the cousins. And those would have been the three that Tezuka was making the difficult decision among when Tezuka reached adulthood. And I think you'd have to situate Tezuka very precisely in time in the Terra Ignota future, because of course the dynamics between those hives shift over time.
Right.
In something which will only mean things to people who finished book 4, Mirai.
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Is exactly where happily he would land when that's possibility
Right,
as
when that
as
becomes an option,
sub-faction.
right.
But whether he would have gone with Utopia or with Greenpeace Mitsubishi is a hard call.
Yeah,
Because I think he would have loved Utopia, but Greenpeace would have been a path that let him continue to have his very strong Japanese national identity.
sure.
I suspect he probably would have gone with Utopia,
That
but
was
that it
my
would
guess
not
as
have
well.
been an easy choice.
Right. And I think it would have been an uncomfortable fit too, because he wasn't an idealist, although he kind of was, but he really wasn't. He was, I think, naturally pessimist, and I think it would have
But so
borderline-
is Huxley Mojave. I mean,
Right.
so are, Utopia does have a streak of we are working for these things,
Right,
but
but-
also the world is bad. And I think what would have finalized his decision is the other half, the Astra Mortemque, right? Because Utopia has two goals. It is to conquer death and reach the stars,
And reach
or
the
rather,
stars, right.
blade by blade, disarm death. And Tezuka the doctor, Tezuka the medical activist, as well as Tezuka the environmental activist, I think would have been very drawn to dedicating himself to advancing the group that is not only reaching for the stars, but blade by blade, disarming death, curing diseases, making the world safer in
and
that
better.
way.
Right.
And his grim pragmatism and his preparedness for humanity to be bad is something we see Utopia express. Utopia is always prepared to be the butt of a drunken's hate, and prepared to have to take the difficult thing and be the butt end of people's prejudices, and see the world make nasty decisions.
Right.
And so I think that would have convinced him in the end, but he would still have been a member of the Japanese nation strat.
Right.
And still very interested in the Greenpeace Mitsubishi and sympathetic with them and a conduit between the two. But the fact that it isn't just space and robots, it's space and robots and disarming death. And he really cared about that after watching the war. He really cared about that, through Blackjack. But remember, we are also having to imagine a Tezuka who didn't live through the war, because
because
there's been world peace for 300 years.
Yeah, but you know what? I kind of always feel like I think he would have probably had the same drive anyway. And I also think the idea that he would be a cousin also,
I don't
find cousins appealing.
I don't know if he would have arrived at the same pessimism. I think he would have had the same drive about reforming the medical world.
Right.
I think he would have been driven, he would have been deeply interested in Buddhism. I think he would have been deeply interested in medicine. I think he would have written Blackjack and called out all of those
things, but maybe
those
not
kinds of
some of the other stuff, right?
But I don't know if a Tezuka who didn't watch the firebombing of Osaka would believe that there's only a 1% chance of avoiding genocide. I think that Tezuka might have thought that it was 50-50.
Okay.
Right. And still cared about environmentalism and all of these other things, but I think he may have had a wider sliver of what he thought humanity, how likely he thought humanity was to make the right choice.
That's certainly fair. So let's move on to Revolutionary Girl Utena. So obviously there's bits of that in Terra Ignota as well, and I jokingly referred to the fact that every time I read Togenkyo in Terra Ignota, Zetai Unmei Mokustroku popped up into my head, and you said can confirm, which made me so happy. But so I ended up thinking about that song for like the entire time I was reading the book. What are some of your favorite moments of Revolutionary Girl Utena?
I mean, the way it all comes together is going to be the real answer. The way it finally comes together, and we see that this is a battle of archetypes and a battle of the narratives themselves that we are stuck in being the challenge. And then also, one of the characteristics of of Utena that is unlike Tezuka, but is a little bit, there's not very many other examples. I guess Mob Psycho is one where, everything is coming together to the head that this genre heads to, and then someone just says, let's not, we're not going to do that. That isn't what we want to do. Let's break the narrative and do the correct, better thing that is in our hearts and do it. And that's great. And I associate that kind of attitude with the Hopepunk movement, which is the post-2016 science fiction movement that's very interested in the, we have a lot of fiction about how when the going gets tough, everyone betrays each other. And when there's an apocalypse, it takes like 5 minutes for biker gangs with skull hats to rampaging through the streets. In a real apocalypse, everyone just gets together and makes soup and help each other. And maybe we should depict humans coming together and being excellent more, because that's actually how human beings behave. But we are teaching ourselves through fiction that it isn't. We depict in fiction a nastier human race than studies of real disasters show is actually the case. Are there terrible people who do terrible things? Yes. But not as high a proportion of moments as we get in fiction. And fiction doesn't have a lot of depictions of resilience, teamwork, of everything going on, everyone saying,
of society being social.
Let's turn that around and do better. And Utena has that spirit to it as well, of the, the enemy here is actually the narrative. It's not you, it's not me, it's not any of this. It's actually
the story we told ourselves is the story.
Being trapped in the expectation that this is how it has to go. And in Utena, fascinatingly, people are sort of fighting over getting to be the protagonist. And the correct answer is don't be the protagonist. Do a better thing than have this story again. Because
stop telling yourself that story. Exactly.
And Utena is the person who rises to the center, because Utena is the person who doesn't even want to be the protagonist. Utena is the person who realizes, no, this isn't about me, this is about Anshi, and this is about moving on and changing everything. So I loved that. And I love I think while there are many characters who show up early on that have very obvious Rosa Versailles and Utena resonances, my beta readers, when Dominic showed up, were like, our sort of Oscar / Utena character is showing up, neat. And in fact, I had the interesting problem that while I had a wide variety of beta readers of different ages and different ethnicities and different religions and religiosities and different sexual orientations, and I had non-binary and I had trans beta readers, 100% of my beta readers had watched Utena. and so I was blindsided by what people would feel about Dominic who hadn't watched Utena, because I had 0 examples of that. And that was really fascinating and odd. And I definitely should have had some non-Utena beta readers, because there were elements of what Dominic codes that weren't transparent if you were not a Utena watcher. Everyone in my extended network had all watched Utena. It was very interesting homogeny to deal with. So there are very obvious connections, like what I'm doing with Dominic and what I'm doing in the Doms and what I'm doing with the characters who get enmeshed with the Doms. But moments like Sniper just cutting through stuff and being better and making a better choice.
Which was
very much like Utena the person. And things like the moment in Utena when it's Wakaba's turn in Black Rose, and Utena just won't. Just like, nope,
she refuses to engage.
No, I'm not gonna fight you. This is wrong. I'm gonna do a better thing. And Sniper is like that in a lot of important ways. And there are characters in it that are very, I sometimes see them as an animated character rather than a live action character. People often ask me, do you have a dream cast for this? And I'm like, yes, but half of them are actors and half of them are Seiyu. And like the imagined version of it in my head would have to be half animated and half live action. Because, I really want Helen Mirren to be Papa Delias, but
that'd be awesome.
Has to be voiced by Seki Toshihiko. And people, very few people understand both halves. And Mycroft's voiceover must be Derek Jacobi, but a number of others have to be different Seiyu, although so many great new people come across that I'm always changing my mind about who should be Sniper, because there's so many awesome options.
Excellent.
But so I would say that the gender and narrative and breaking a narrative parts are in there, but also just some of the admirableness of how excellent a person Utena really is in the end, all the way through.
All the way through. So who's your favorite character, and why is it Anthony? I mean, honestly, she's great. I mean, she's a great character.
So when we did, I mean, you don't always cosplay your favorite character, but when we did our large Utena cosplay group in which we did the casting in various ways, but also partly by height, I was actually cosplaying Akio. Because the real answer is that the most powerful
I win my bet.
part,
I knew you were going to say Akio.
Is the most powerful part is that relationship. My actual favorite character is probably Mikage.
Okay.
And I really love Mikage and Mikage's arc. But largely, I think the reason I fell in love with Mikage is that Black Rose is the moment at which Utena goes from incomprehensible and sort of off-putting, which the whole first season really is.
Really kind of is.
Right? To incomprehensible, but clearly awesome and clearly building towards
psychological, something.
And so I think Mikage's arrival was also the moment that Utena was like, oh, this is great. I'm no longer weirded out trying to figure out whether this is going anywhere. I'm now confident that it's going anywhere. And this awesome new person, Mikage, has appeared. So Mikage is my favorite in a sense. Utena is my favorite in another sense. I think Utena is one of the best characters in all of fiction that I've ever encountered. And just all the way through, such amazing things that are done with Utena, including the intertextuality of the multiple versions and the movie version of Utena and the movie, and Toga also gains a whole lot of richness when you do the intertextual cross comparisons. Toga is a great character, but Toga and movie Toga and manga Toga together
are just, amazing characters.
And I would say that it's interesting, in the television series, I don't think Toga is a better character than Yuri or
Mickey or
Sayama necessarily, but the triangulation of the Togas in the three works sort of four, but the movie manga is kind of not as much in it. That triangulation is stronger than any of the other triangulations. And that Toga really develops as a character when you have those three to mix with each other, partly because movie Toga is also Mikage, and merging those two together is so effective.
For me, it's always Anshi because she's pretty much the Shakti of the entire story.
Well, she's the center.
She's the engine that drives the entire story, and so I feel like you can plumb that endlessly forever.
Well, which is why I begin with the Anshi Akio Dios dynamic plus Utena is the heart of what is happening. Is what you have to answer as your favorite character, because it's the thing.
But then there's Utena, who is so amazing, and now exactly. Cool. So you've actually answered one of the themes you found most intriguing, so you pretty much answered that, and we talked about that. Is there anything that we have not covered that you would love to answer and nobody ever asks you?
Well, just I wanted to say a little bit more about, the science fiction world is full of people who are very interested in science fiction and fantasy, and very, unfamiliar with anime and manga. And I try to work hard to be an ambassador there. And it's interesting how almost gun shy people are about it, because a lot of people who love anime and manga will go about trying to describe it to other people in a very inept and off-putting way. And gush about a series that is great, but that is great because it's a commentary on other earlier series and deconstructing this and that. And you have to be a fairly leveled up consumer of anime and manga to get anything out of that particular series. And it's fascinating to me how often I'll talk to fellow science fiction novelists, and I'll say, XYZ cool science fiction thing is in a manga. And they're like, wow, that's the first time anyone's ever talked to me about a manga in a way that I understood and it sounded cool, instead of sort of ranting at me about a thing that I couldn't figure out what it was about.
Passion can do that to people. Passion can make us very incoherent when we love stuff.
It can. And so I actually play a game where I'll sometimes sit down with novelists and be like, so there's a really great engagement with what it would mean for an AI to commit homicide in this, and I'll just describe that bit, and they're like, that's great, thank you. I have authors who like say one of their favorite activities is sit around with me and have me describe the interesting plots of anime and manga to them. But an important detail within that is that anime and manga are huge media. Only a small sliver of it is science fiction or fantasy.
Right.
And anime and manga have a long learning curve. You really have to consume a bunch of it before you're fluent enough with the art style to really get the subtleties of what's being communicated by the art.
Right.
You have to invest a bunch in it. And I think we have to be more willing to have conversations sometimes with people where we don't expect this person is ever going to read or watch it, but we still want them to get something out of it.
To understand it.
Because it isn't worthwhile for someone whose main thing is, a particular kind of hard SF to invest all of the time in getting good enough at anime and manga to then consume the 6 really good hard SF anime and manga that are not good because they're commenting on other anime and manga, but that are good because of their dialogue with science fiction. And so if I sit down with that person and say, I'm going to tell you the really interesting parts of Gunbuster, the really interesting parts of Gundam, the what is going on in Evangelion and how it triangulates science fiction expectations with metaphysics.
Right.
And, and then these 2 details from Concrete Revolutio and Mob Psycho 100.
Right.
And then they say, wow, that was really cool and a really worthwhile 45 minutes. And then they have a bunch of really fruitful ideas to take back to their genre and write about.
Right.
And it's incredibly hard for people to find otaku who will have that conversation.
Yeah.
Because we almost always have it with the, you'll love it, you gotta try it.
Here, but don't worry about the first 13 episodes aren't good. It gets better. In the 6th volume, there's actually a podcast right now called Mangasplaining that I obsessively consume, and they are doing that, right? They're reading volumes of manga with it's 3 people who are very embedded in manga, 1 person who isn't, and they're basically explaining what this other person isn't getting, and they're now in their 2nd season, and Chip Zdarsky, who is the non-manga person, is already starting to do compares and contrasts. So you could see that he's no longer not a non-manga person, because yes, he's doing the level up part. But yes, it's very hard. Aside from this, most people have a great deal of difficulty being level-headed about their own passions. Of course. I mean, that's one thing that's always, but not everybody's a comparative literature major like I am and can say, okay, let me explain that this thing is actually a reference to this thing here. And when the important part is that you need to know they both are commentary on this 3rd thing. And if you don't know that, you don't know.
But I think it just means it's valuable to realize when it's a good point to say, you know what? I'm just going to spoil the heck out of this.
Well, you're not going to read it.
And I'm going to tell it, and you're going to get out of it what is really cool. And then you're going to go think about that when you read and watch other stuff that relates to it. Right. And that sometimes that's the right conversation. And if we're willing to have that conversation, everyone's happier.
Yeah, I mean, I feel it's interesting that because with you and Tam Samir being a Homestuck fan, I think fandom and fanfic and those conversations that we're all having in fandom, these things are less stigmatized now. But I want to say that one of the reasons that there's such a reticence about anime and manga, I remember back in the 70s where the sci-fi cons actively discriminated against comic books and any hint of Japanese content, and they were really like, this stuff will not depurify our pure science fiction. So there's still a lot of that.
There are still people in science fiction who find it threatening. Who's, this is an alien thing, it's not my fandom, its presence means that I am uncomfortable. That's diminishing a bit, but this kind of conversation, you're like, hey, and sometimes I'll be cunning and I'll say, there's a great work called title in which cool science fiction thing happens. Oh, neat. Where can I find that? Well, it's a manga. I'll sometimes be very careful about it and do it in that roundabout way, because when you just say, in this, it's this. People are open to it. And once someone has had that happen to them, then the next time they walk past the anime room at their con, they're a little less uncomfortable with it. Because they've had that positive encounter.
Right, and they have an entree, and I think
Yeah.
that's really a
Yeah.
key point, is
You know,
having some entree to it.
and they're not going to enter. They're not going to go in the anime room. They're just
Right.
going to not feel uncomfortable walking past the anime room. And they're not going to feel like this isn't my fandom. They're going to feel like this is my fandom. It's just not a part of my
Not a
fandom
piece of it
that
that I'm
do.
engaging with. Absolutely.
Exactly.
We are starting to get a little, very, very little bit of through isekai, particularly, we're getting a lot of fantasy Japanese stuff. But we're also, I want to say that we have Other Side Picnic, which, have you read that at all?
I haven't, but I know what it is.
Right.
Yeah,
And I think it's really interesting because it itself is actually referencing Roadside Picnic, which is a Russian science fiction novel. So we're starting to get that global conversation
Yes.
thing again, which and now that's starting to come here and bringing sort of science fiction and horror from Japan to America, which I think is really a great trend. You know,
and we're getting some Chinese stuff and lots of stuff. But you know, it's interesting to me how often people who really follow science fiction and fantasy don't know that any of the Japanese light novels are being published.
Right, of course,
and
and
it's
they
not
wouldn't.
the same presses. And
right.
You know,
yeah, they wouldn't know because it's not marketed to that audience. It's marketed to
but you know, those are totally eligible for best novelette and best novella.
Yep.
And the Hugos, but they're not going to make the ballot for the same reason that anime never makes the long form and short form ballot. Just people aren't like thinking of them.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So I have one final question.
Yes.
Terra Ignota is aspirational.
Yes.
And there's no question that it is clearly aspirational, particularly at the end where it basically says we are aspirational and you will listen. Have you found any other media, recent or not, to be aspirational for yourself?
So if you Google Ada Palmer Hopepunk, you'll find my recent essay about Hopepunk, where I talk about Hopepunk as a genre and a medium. And yes, there's been a bunch of it. There's a book by Ruthanna Emry coming out soon called A Half-Built Garden, which is about medium to near future climate change disaster, post-climate disaster reconstruction is the focus. And that one is definitely needed, definitely aspirational. Also, Joe Walton's Thessaly books, which are, you know, they're heavily influenced by Terra Ignota, but they're also, because she read it and then wrote them and then they came out and then it came out. So it's sort of out of order. But, you know, Plato, but it's very much about, hey, let's try to make a better society. Well, that didn't work. What did we learn from it? Let's keep the good parts. Okay, look, we made a better society by trying again. When we learned from our first one what didn't work, instead of burning it down. And I think there's a lot of neat, instead of burning it down, we do X stuff that's starting to trickle out. And I list some more of it in that essay about Hopepunk. So I would recommend that highly to people who want that kind of recommendation.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely delightful. It's everything I could have hoped for. Thank you.
Well, I love talking about these things and I never get asked about them. So
well,
I should say, by the way, for anyone who's looking at me and being like, she's vaguely familiar, where have I seen her before? I was Kei-san at Anime Boston, who hosted Cosplay Human Chess for many years. So a lot of you have seen me on stage at Anime Boston at Cosplay Human Chess. But a lot of people can't quite place me when I have my glasses on. I remember sometimes when I would be in Boston, I was with a friend who was one of the other staff who helped host chess once. We were walking by a ramen shop and someone recognized me and shouted like, Aizen, and we went over there. They were talking and gushing about how much they liked it, and then I just took my glasses off, and the person was like, "Kei-san," I didn't recognize. I was like, I got to do the Clark Kent thing. I actually got to do the take your glasses off.
Take your glasses off, and you're some way completely recognizable.
Yeah.
I've been invited to this year's Anime Boston.
Oh, great.
I'm a big fan of Anime Boston. I've been invited to be a feature panelist, and the world being what it is, I don't know if I'll be able to make it, but I'm hoping to make it. It'll be my first time back in years.
I started working at them at the third Anime Boston, and it was the next year that we made the conviction to every year try at least one new cosplay event. And that was how Anime Boston started having so many different cosplay events and new
Nice.
ones, and pioneering the anime dating game and Catch the Barrel. I don't know if anyone still does Catch the Barrel anymore. And just there were a lot of different things, and the staff vote costume contest and the emergency costume repair station, which is the most rewarding work.
I remember that one. Yeah.
The most rewarding work ever, man. Having a 6-hour shift of having adorable crying fairies come in because their wing is broken and fixing them, and then having them bounce up and down and be cheerful again is the most emotionally rewarding work you can possibly imagine, in addition to challenging your costuming ingenuity as you think, how can I fix this quickly? So that was great. My medical condition I don't have the stamina anymore.
I understand that. Absolutely.
So I haven't been able to be at Anime Boston the last few years because of that, though I hope to still at some point. But right now I'm concentrating on trying to be well enough to get off disability leave.
I totally understand that as well. It's amazing when you're chronically ill. It's just the whole thing with spoons. It's not even about I have so many spoons. I might have someone. I wake up and then 10 minutes later they're just gone. They're just not there. So yeah, no, I'm 100% with you. I'm hoping that I'll be up to it, and I'm hoping that the world will be up to it. We'll see if we can both be up to it at the same time, but it's going to be a lot of work. Yeah. Okay, well, again, thank you, Ada. Thank you very much.
And thank you to all your huge services to the manga community as well. I mean, you're one of our backbones.
It is my genuine pleasure to talk about stuff. That's what it comes down to. So thank you. I really can't thank you enough. And anytime, you're welcome to come back anytime and talk about cool stuff.
I'd love to.
Super. Thank you. Well, I'll let you go. It's getting a little late, but have a great night. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a great night. Bye-bye.